The man didn't raise his voice. That was the worst part. Sheriff Aldous Crane walked to the center of the crowd, unfolded a single piece of paper, and read Clara Whitlock's name out loud, not as an introduction, but as a verdict. He said she had abandoned her last post without notice. He said the children of Red Hollow deserved better than a woman who ran when things got difficult. He didn't look at her once. Not once. He spoke about her the way a person speaks about a stain on the floorboards, something to be removed before it ruins the wood beneath. Clara stood 12 feet away and heard every word. And the crowd, her crowd, people she had traveled 4 days to serve, they nodded. If that had been you standing there, your bag still dusty from the road, your father barely 3 weeks in the ground, what would you have done? Well, before we go any further, if stories about ordinary people refusing to stay broken move something in you, please subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. We find these stories so you don't have to go looking. And while you're watching, drop a comment below with your city and country. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Every single comment means the world. Now let's go back to Red Hollow, 1883, and to a woman who had no idea that the worst moment of her life was also the first step toward the only home she'd ever truly have. Clara Whitlock had not eaten since the morning she left the last town. That was 4 days ago. She'd counted the hours the way a person counts money they don't have, carefully, desperately, trying to make something small stretch further than it should. The stagecoach had dropped her at the edge of Red Hollow just after noon, and she had walked the remaining half-mile with her trunk dragging behind her because the driver wouldn't bring it the full way. Something about the road being too soft after last week's rain. She hadn't argued. She was too tired to argue, and arguing cost something she couldn't afford to spend. She had a letter in her coat pocket. An official letter from the Red Hollow School Board, signed by 3 men whose names she had memorized because they represented everything she had worked toward since her father fell sick 18 months ago. The letter said she was hired. It said a room would be arranged. It said the children of Red Hollow needed a teacher, and she was the one they had chosen. She had read that letter so many times the fold lines had gone soft. She reached the main street of Red Hollow at 1:30 in the afternoon and immediately understood that something was wrong. There were too many people standing outside for a Tuesday. Men in work clothes who should have been at their trades, women with market baskets they had stopped bothering to carry, children hovering at the edges of adult conversations, the way children do when they know something important is happening and no one will explain it. The crowd was gathered near the steps of what Clara assumed was the town hall, a wide wooden building with a faded painted sign she couldn't read from this distance. She slowed down. She told herself she was just catching her breath, that her trunk was heavy and her arms ached, and it made sense to stop for a moment. But the truth was she felt something shift in the air, the way you feel weather before it arrives, a pressure change, a stillness that isn't peaceful. A woman near the edge of the crowd glanced at Clara, then looked quickly away. That was the moment Clara should have turned around. She didn't. She straightened her coat, picked up the handle of her trunk, and walked toward the crowd because the letter in her pocket said she had every right to be there, and she had spent the last 18 months doing whatever it took to survive, and she was not going to let tired legs and a strange feeling stop her now. She made it to the outer ring of the crowd just as Sheriff Aldous Crane unfolded his piece of paper. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with a gray mustache that he wore with the seriousness of a man who considers his appearance a form of authority. He held the paper the way a judge holds a ruling, not reading from it so much as displaying it, letting everyone see that what he was about to say was official, documented, beyond dispute. He cleared his throat once. "Folks," he said, loud enough to carry, "before we welcome any newcomers to this community, I feel it's my duty to share some information that the school board received this morning by telegraph." Clara stopped walking. She didn't know why yet. She didn't yet understand that the word newcomers was aimed at her specifically, that this entire gathering had been arranged around her arrival the way a trap is arranged around bait. She didn't know any of that. She only knew her feet stopped moving and her hand tightened on the trunk handle until her knuckles ached. "It has come to our attention," Crane continued, his voice smooth and measured, each word placed with the deliberate care of a man who enjoys the sound of his own judgment, "that the woman hired to teach our children, a Miss Clara Whitlock, left her previous position in the town of Grayford without notice, without explanation, and in the middle of an academic term." The crowd shifted. Someone murmured. A woman near the front put her hand over her mouth. Clara felt the blood drain out of her face. She left 14 children without instruction for 6 weeks, Crane said. The families of Grayford were forced to bring in a replacement at considerable expense and disruption. The children suffered academically. Several families have written to us directly. He paused then. And that pause was calculated. Clara understood even in that moment, even as her whole body had gone cold. That pause was for effect. That pause was for the crowd to look around at each other and confirm that yes, they were all hearing the same thing. Yes, they were all equally alarmed. Yes, this was a collective judgment, and not just one man's opinion. I cannot in good conscience, Crane said, folding the paper with slow precision, allow this woman to take charge of our children's education. He still hadn't looked at her, not once. Clara opened her mouth. She wasn't entirely sure what she intended to say. Some version of, let me explain, some version of my father was dying, some version of I wrote letters, I arranged a substitute, I did everything I could. But before she could form a single word, a man beside her, middle-aged, wearing a merchant's vest, physically stepped sideways to put distance between them. Just half a step. Just enough. Just enough to make clear which side of this he was on. The crowd began to break apart the way crowds do when an event has concluded. Not all at once, but in clusters, people drifting away in pairs and threes, conversations beginning that Clara was no longer part of. Mothers reached for children's hands. Men turned back toward their businesses. Within 2 minutes, the gathering that had been arranged specifically around her arrival was simply gone, dispersed like smoke, leaving Clara standing on the main street of a town she didn't know with a trunk she could barely carry and a letter in her pocket that was already worthless. She did not cry. She wanted to. The wanting was physical, a pressure behind her sternum that she had learned over 18 months of watching her father disappear to keep locked somewhere deep and breathe through carefully. She pressed her lips together and breathed. One person remained. She noticed him because he wasn't moving. Everyone else had found a reason to leave, and this man was standing perhaps 20 feet away with 2 children beside him, one on each side, and he was watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately classify. Not pity. Not curiosity exactly. Something more careful than either of those things. He was not a large man, but he looked solid, the way things built to last look solid. A working man's hands, a working man's posture, clothes that were clean but bore the permanent shadow of hard use. The girl beside him might have been 10 or 11, with her father's same watchful eyes. The boy was younger, maybe 7, and he was staring at Clara's trunk with the frank interest of a child who hasn't yet learned to pretend he isn't looking at something. Clara looked back at the man because she didn't have anywhere else to look. He crossed the distance between them without hurry. He had the walk of someone who doesn't expend energy on things that aren't necessary. "Ma'am," he said. She waited. "My name is Elias Boone." He didn't offer his hand, not rudeness, more like he'd decided the formality could wait until they'd said something real to each other. "I run the blacksmith shop on the west end of Carver Street." "Clara Whitlock," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I know," he said. "I heard." "Then you know I've apparently just lost a position before I could start it." He didn't deny it, which she appreciated more than she could have explained. "That's one way to put it," he said. The girl beside him was still watching Clara with those careful eyes. The boy had lost interest in the trunk and was now looking at Clara's face with the kind of direct, uncomplicating stare that children specialize in. "Can you teach?" Elias asked. It was such a plain question, after everything that had just happened, after the crowd and the folded paper and the sheriff's measured voice. Can you teach? Not is what they said true, and not can I trust you, and not why did you really leave Grayford, just the essential thing. "Yes," Clara said. He nodded once, the way a man nods when he's made a decision that he's already worked out the practical consequences of. "I've got a room above the forge," he said. "It's not much. It's warm enough, and it's clean. And it costs nothing because I'm not asking for rent. I've got 2 children who need educating, and I've got no one to do it." He paused. "You teach them. You've got a room and meals and something useful to do while you figure out your next step. That's the arrangement, if you want it." Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at the girl, who had not stopped watching her. "What's your name?" Clara asked the girl. "Nora," the girl said. Then, after a small hesitation that felt like a decision, "Our mother died last spring." Clara felt something move inside her chest. Not pity. She was careful about pity. She'd been on the receiving end of it enough to know it mostly benefited the person offering it. What she felt was more like recognition. The specific loneliness of loss that hasn't been given permission to be finished yet. "I'm sorry, Nora," she said. Nora gave a short nod, like her father. "And you?" Clara asked the boy. "Samuel," he said. "But Pa calls me Sam." He frowned. "I don't really like reading." "Sam," his father said. "It's all right," Clara said, and she almost smiled. "Most people don't. At first." She picked up the handle of her trunk. Her arm still ached and she was still hungry, and the letter in her pocket was still worthless, and she had just been publicly humiliated in front of an entire town by a man who hadn't even had the basic decency to look at her while he did it. None of that had changed. But something else had changed. Something small and provisional, the way a candle flame is small and provisional. Enough light to take one step and then another. "Show me the room," she said. Elias Boone reached for her trunk without asking and lifted it like it weighed nothing. He didn't make a production of it. He just picked it up and started walking, and his children fell into step beside him, and after a moment Clara followed. She had no way of knowing, walking through Red Hollow for the first time with her reputation already in ruins, that this was the beginning. That the town she was walking through would eventually feel like the only place she had ever truly belonged. She had no way of knowing about the school board meetings that would come, the gossip that would metastasize, the moment 6 weeks from now when she would stand in a doorway at midnight listening to a 7-year-old boy try to sound out his dead mother's name. Letter by careful letter, Mari, 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 until it finally came together and he burst into tears she wasn't supposed to hear. She didn't know any of it yet. She just walked. The forge was exactly what she'd expected and nothing like what she'd pictured. The heat reached her half a block away, and the smell of metal and coal and wood smoke was so strong it felt like walking into something solid. The building itself was wide and low-ceilinged, with a great black furnace at its heart that Elias had banked down for the afternoon, glowing orange at the edges like something barely containing itself. Tools hung on every wall. There were iron pieces in various stages of completion stacked against the far wall. Hinges, hooks, the curved ribs of what might eventually become a wagon wheel frame. It was a working place. Not beautiful, not comfortable, but completely, unambiguously real. The room above was accessed by a narrow outside staircase that ran along the building's east wall. Elias carried her trunk up it ahead of her without apparent difficulty and pushed the door open with his shoulder. The room was small, a single window faced north. There was a cot with a quilt that had been carefully folded and smoothed. Someone had prepared this space, Clara realized, which meant someone had expected her arrival and decided she deserved basic dignity, regardless of what the sheriff had said. There was a small table with a lamp, a wooden chair, a narrow shelf. The ceiling was low enough that Clara could have touched it if she'd reached up. "The children sleep in the house," Elias said, setting down her trunk. "Kitchen's through the back of the forge. Meals are at 6 and noon. I start work at 5 in the morning. That's going to be loud. I can't help that." "I don't sleep late," Clara said. He looked at her for a moment like he was deciding whether to say something. Then, "Crane's not wrong about all of it. I know you left Grayford. I don't know why, and I'm not asking, but people in this town are going to ask, and some of them are going to ask ugly. I know. I'm not making you any promises about what I can protect you from." "I'm not asking for promises," Clara said. Something shifted in his expression, just briefly, just a small thing. "All right," he said. He left. His footsteps went down the stairs and back toward the forge, and she heard the particular clang of metal on metal a few minutes later. A specific kind of work rhythm, constant and unself-conscious, the sound of a man returning to what he knows. Clara sat down on the edge of the cot. The quilt was faded blue and white, a double wedding ring pattern, and it had been washed recently. She could smell it, the specific clean smell of laundry dried in open air. She pressed her hand flat against it. She thought about Grayford. She thought about the telegram she'd received telling her that her father's lungs had filled with fluid and that the doctor gave him maybe 3 weeks. She thought about the morning she'd left, how she'd written 5 letters, to the school board, to the parents of her students, to the woman she thought could substitute, to the county administrator, to anyone she could think of, explaining, apologizing, asking for understanding. She had done everything right. She had done everything exactly right, and it hadn't mattered because Aldous Crane had received a different set of letters, the ones written by the 3 or 4 families in Grayford, who were angry regardless of circumstances, who had been angry before she left, and would have found something else to be angry about if she'd stayed. You could do everything right, Clara had learned, and it still wouldn't protect you from someone who had decided you were guilty before they looked at the evidence. She thought about that for a while in the small room above the forge, with the smell of coal smoke coming up through the floorboards, and the sound of Elias Boone working below her, steady and rhythmic as a heartbeat. Then she opened her trunk, took out the small brass handbell she carried everywhere. It had been her mother's, and then hers, and it was the one thing she had never been willing to leave behind, and set it on the narrow shelf where she could see it. She didn't know what the next day would bring. She didn't know if the children would like her, or if the town would drive her out before she got any traction, or if Elias Boone's offer would turn into something more complicated than it appeared. She didn't know any of it. But she was here. She had a room, and a window, and a shelf, and tomorrow morning at 6 o'clock she was going to find out what a 7-year-old boy who didn't like reading actually knew how to do, and she was going to start from there. She reached into her trunk and pulled out a primer, set it on the table beside the lamp. Outside, the afternoon light was changing, going amber and long, laying itself across the dirt of Carver Street in the particular way that late light in new places has of making everything look both strange and briefly, painfully beautiful. Clara Whitlock had nothing. She had been publicly stripped of her reputation by a man who hadn't even thought she was worth looking at. She was hungry and exhausted, and she was sleeping in a room above a blacksmith's forge in a town that had already decided what it thought of her. She also had a room with a clean quilt, 2 children who needed something only she could give, and a man who had asked her exactly the right question. "Can you teach?" Yes, she thought. Yes. That at least she knew how to do. She opened the primer to the first page, and in the forge below, Elias Boone kept working, the hammer falling in its steady, patient rhythm, and the day kept moving around them both. This woman who had been broken by something she hadn't deserved, and this man who had watched his own life come apart one slow piece at a time, and 2 children who needed more than either of them had so far figured out how to provide. None of them knew what they were beginning. Not yet. The first morning, Clara woke before Elias did. She lay still for a moment in the narrow cot, listening to the silence, trying to remember where she was. Then the smell hit her, coal smoke and iron and the particular cold metal sharpness of a forge that had been banked overnight, and she remembered all of it at once. Red Hollow. The sheriff and his folded paper. Elias Boone and his 2 careful children. The clean quilt. The primer she'd left open on the table. She got up, dressed in the dark, and went downstairs. The kitchen was through a door at the back of the forge, just as Elias had said. It was a small room attached to the main building, with a wood stove and a table that had been scrubbed so many times the grain of the wood had gone pale and soft-looking. There were 4 chairs. One of them was clearly not used, pushed in tighter than the others, its seat without the worn-down quality of regular use. Clara looked at it for a moment and then looked away. She found flour and a tin of lard and managed to put together something that resembled biscuits by the time she heard footsteps on the stairs. Small footsteps first, uneven, the way a child walks who is not yet fully awake. Sam appeared in the doorway in his nightshirt, his hair going every direction, blinking at her with the foggy suspicion of a 7-year-old who has walked into something unexpected before his brain has finished waking up. "You made food," he said. "I tried," Clara said. "The biscuits might be a little heavy." He came to the table and sat down and picked up a biscuit and bit into it. His face went through several careful negotiations. "It's okay," he said finally, which she understood to mean it was not especially good, but he was going to eat it anyway because he was hungry. "Thank you for the honesty," she said. He looked up at her. "Nora says I'm too honest." "Nora's probably right, but I don't mind." He thought about this while chewing. "Are you really going to teach us?" "That's the plan." "Even though the sheriff said you're bad at it?" Clara set down the spoon she'd been holding. "Sheriff Crane didn't say I was bad at teaching. He said I left my last job without warning." "Did you?" "Sam." Nora had appeared in the doorway, dressed, and with her hair already braided with a neatness that suggested she'd been doing it herself for a while. She gave her brother the specific look that older sisters have been perfecting since the beginning of recorded time. "It's a fair question," Clara said. She looked at Sam. Yes, I did leave without warning. My father was very sick and I had to go to him. I wrote letters explaining, but some people were still angry. That's the part the sheriff read. Sam considered this with the gravity of someone weighing a complex legal matter. That doesn't sound bad, he said. If my pa was sick, I'd go too. Sam, Nora said again, but differently this time. Elias walked in then, stooping slightly under the door frame out of habit rather than necessity. The door was tall enough, and stopped when he saw the biscuits on the table. He looked at Clara. She looked back at him. I used your flour, she said. I'll replace it. You don't need to replace it, he said. He sat down, took a biscuit, ate half of it in one bite without apparent concern for its quality. You sleep all right? Fine. Forge starts up in about an hour. It'll be loud. You mentioned that. He nodded and poured himself coffee from the pot she'd also managed to locate and start. And for a few minutes, the four of them sat around the table in that particular silence of people who don't yet know each other well enough to feel quiet comfortably, eating biscuits that were slightly too dense and drinking coffee that was slightly too strong. And outside the window, Red Hollow was just beginning to make its morning noises. It was, Clara thought, the strangest breakfast she had ever eaten, and somehow not the worst. She started lessons that same morning. She hadn't asked Elias's permission for this specifically. Their arrangement had been loose enough that she decided to interpret looseness as latitude. She cleared one end of the work table in the corner of the forge that wasn't used for anything currently and set out the primer and a piece of chalk she'd brought in her trunk and a small practice slate she'd bought in the last town before Grayford. She called the children at 9 o'clock. Nora came immediately. Sam came after a delay of approximately 4 minutes, during which she could hear him outside doing something that involved kicking a fence post repeatedly. Sam, she said when he finally appeared. I know, he said. He sat down. She started with Nora first, quickly, because it took her about 3 minutes of conversation to determine that Nora could read adequately, not brilliantly, but adequately, and that what Nora actually needed was arithmetic, specifically the kind of arithmetic that would let her understand the business records her father kept in a ledger that she had apparently been trying to decipher on her own for the past several months. That was interesting. Clara filed it away. Then she turned to Sam. She slid the primer in front of him, open to the first page. Simple words. 3 letters each. Cat, hat, bat, mat. Sam looked at the page the way a person looks at something they've already decided they don't like. Read the first word, Clara said. He looked at it. His jaw tightened. I know what it says. Then tell me. It says, cat. He said it too fast, the way people say things they've memorized rather than read. Look at the letters, Clara said. She kept her voice completely neutral. Not the picture, the letters. What's the first one? A long pause. C, he said. Reluctant. Good. Next one. Another pause, longer. Something was happening in his face that Clara recognized. Not stubbornness exactly, but the specific kind of resistance that comes from having failed at something enough times that trying feels more dangerous than not trying. She'd seen it before. In Grayford. In the boy who sat in the back corner and never raised his hand because he'd learned that raised hands led to wrong answers and wrong answers led to laughter. A, Sam said, very quietly. Good, Clara said. Same neutral voice. Last one. He looked at the letter, his lips moved slightly. T, he said. Put them together. He looked at the whole word. Cat, he said. And then, unexpectedly, he looked up at her with an expression of such surprised relief, like he'd expected a trap and found instead that the floor held his weight, that Clara had to look down at the primer for a moment. Good, she said. Next word. From across the forge, she was aware of Elias pausing in his work, just briefly, just long enough to be listening. Then the hammer started again. The weeks that followed had a rhythm that Clara hadn't expected to find comforting and did anyway. Mornings, lessons with the children while Elias worked. Afternoons, she helped where she could, mending, cooking, carrying, whatever needed doing. And Elias answered her questions about the forge when she had them, which surprised him, she could tell. Evenings, Sam would sometimes bring her the primer unprompted and sit beside her at the kitchen table, working through it with the dogged concentration of someone who has decided to conquer something that previously conquered them. She noticed the ledger on the third day. It was sitting on the shelf beside the door to the forge, a thick book with a cracked spine, and it was open to a page that had numbers crossed out and rewritten so many times the page looked like a battlefield. She didn't say anything about it, she just looked. On the fifth day, she asked Nora about it. "It's the business accounts," Nora said. They were sitting at the work table after lessons, and Nora had a tone of voice that was trying to be casual and wasn't quite making it. "Pa does them at night, but I don't think—" She stopped. "You don't think what?" Nora looked at the forge door. Elias was outside with a customer. "I don't think they're right," she said quietly. "The numbers. I've been trying to work them out because I know he's worried about something, but I can't figure out where it goes wrong." Clara looked at the girl. 11 years old, her mother dead 8 months, trying to save her father's business with arithmetic she'd taught herself. "Can I see it?" she asked. Nora hesitated. Then she got up and got the ledger and set it on the table. Clara opened it. She spent about 20 minutes going through it carefully, and what she found made her stomach tighten in a specific, recognizable way. Not because the numbers were fraudulent or catastrophically wrong, but because they were the numbers of a man who was very good at his work and very bad at tracking what he was owed. Materials purchased, yes, all recorded. Labor and time charged, yes. But payments received versus payments promised versus payments that had simply never come. That was where the ledger fell apart. There were at least 4 customers who appeared to owe Elias significant amounts with no follow-up recorded anywhere. She closed the ledger. "Does your father know you've been looking at this?" she asked Nora. "No." "Do you want me to help you work it out properly?" Nora looked at her with those careful eyes. "Can you?" "Arithmetic is arithmetic," Clara said. "And yes." She didn't tell Elias. She worked on it with Nora in the afternoons over the following week, teaching Nora the actual principles of account keeping while they sorted through the mess together, because teaching Nora was the point, not just fixing the problem. By the end of the week, they had a clear picture. Elias was owed nearly $40 from customers who had either forgotten or decided to forget. $40 in Red Hollow in 1883 was not a small number. It was the difference between a forge that survived the winter and one that didn't. Clara wrote out a clean summary in her neatest hand and left it on top of the ledger without a note. She was in the kitchen the next morning when she heard Elias come in from the forge earlier than usual. She heard him stop. She heard silence, the particular quality of silence that means someone is reading something. He appeared in the kitchen doorway about 10 minutes later. "This was you," he said. He was holding the summary. "Nora did most of the arithmetic," Clara said. She was being accurate, not modest. He looked at the paper for a moment longer. Something was working in his face that she couldn't read. "4 customers," he said. "3 of them may have just forgotten. One of them." She stopped because she didn't know these people and she didn't want to make accusations. "One of the entries seems like it might need a direct conversation." He set the paper down on the table. He didn't say thank you. He didn't say anything for a moment, and Clara had already decided that was fine. She hadn't done it to be thanked. When he said, "My wife used to do the accounts." Clara went still. "She was better at it than I am," he said. He said it plainly, without the particular self-consciousness men sometimes have about admitting a woman was better at something than they were. Just a fact. "When she got sick, I tried to keep up with it. Clearly, I didn't." "You were keeping up with other things," Clara said. He picked the paper back up. "I'll go see Harmon today," he said. Harmon being, Clara understood, the one who needed a direct conversation. "Thank you," he said then, quick and a little rough, like the words cost something and he was paying them anyway. "Nora did most of it," Clara said again. The ghost of something crossed his face. "Yeah," he said. "I'm going to need to talk to her about that." He did talk to Nora. Clara wasn't there for it, but she heard Nora's voice through the wall that night. Not the words, just the tone. And Nora's voice was doing something it almost never did. It was shaking. In the good way. The way voices shake when something that has been held very tight is finally allowed to loosen. The gossip started in earnest around the 3rd week. Clara had expected it. She'd felt it building the way you feel weather. That pressure change, that specific quality of silence that greets you when you walk into a room where people were talking about you a moment before. The mercantile was the worst. She went twice for supplies, and both times conversation near her stopped and resumed in a lower register. And a woman she didn't know gave her a smile that was made entirely out of pity and judgment in equal measure. She didn't avoid it. That was the thing. She could have stopped going to the mercantile. She could have sent Nora or found another way. But she made a decision early on that avoiding the town was the same as admitting guilt, and she had nothing to admit. So she went. She kept her back straight and her expression even, and she bought what she needed, and she said good morning to people who did not say good morning back, and she came home. The specific accusation reached her through Nora, which was not ideal. Nora came in from an errand one afternoon with her jaw set at an angle that meant something had happened. She put the package she'd been carrying on the table and stood there for a moment. "Someone said something to you," Clara said. "Martha Crane's daughter," Nora said. Martha Crane being, Clara had figured out by now, the sheriff's wife. "She said you're only here because you needed somewhere to live, that you're using us." She stopped. Her jaw worked. She said pause too simple to see it. Clara was quiet for a moment. She thought carefully about what she wanted to say, because this mattered. This was Nora, and what Clara said now would be something Nora carried. "People say things they can't prove when they don't like that they can't find something to prove," Clara said finally. "That doesn't make it true." "I know it's not true," Nora said immediately, fiercely. "I know you do." It's not fair." The word came out younger than Nora usually sounded, like she'd been keeping it in and it had slipped. "You've been here 3 weeks and you fixed the accounts and Sam is actually reading and you didn't ask for anything and they still—" She stopped herself. Clara looked at her. "No," she said, "it isn't fair." She didn't dress it up. She didn't add a lesson or a silver lining. Some things aren't fair and the best you can do is decide not to let it make you smaller. Nora looked at her for a long moment. "Did it make you smaller? When the sheriff did that?" Clara thought about the honest answer. "For about 10 minutes, she said. "Then I got angry. And anger, used correctly, is very clarifying." Nora almost smiled. Almost. The real trouble started the following Monday when a man named Gerald Fitch, who was apparently on the school board and also owned the largest amount of property in the northeast end of town, came to the forge while Elias was working. Clara was upstairs when she heard the second voice below. Not Elias's measured tones, but something sharper, something with a particular quality of officiousness that she recognized without needing to see the man's face. She didn't go downstairs. She sat on the edge of her cot and listened. She couldn't hear every word, but she caught enough. The phrases that floated up through the floorboards were assembled from the same vocabulary as Sheriff Crane's speech. Not fit, in a household, questions of propriety, what people are saying. Elias's voice underneath them was low and difficult to hear, not because he was being quiet exactly, but because he spoke at a register that didn't carry the way Fitch's did. The conversation went on for about 10 minutes. Then she heard boots on the dirt floor, the door, and then Elias's hammer starting again, immediate, like he was closing a subject. She came downstairs an hour later. Elias was working on a hinge repair, precise and focused. She stood at the edge of his peripheral vision until he acknowledged her. "Fitch," she said. "He came by," Elias said. He set the hinge down and looked at her. His expression was the one he wore when he'd already worked something out and was deciding how much of the work to show. "He's concerned about the arrangement." "What arrangement specifically?" "You living here, teaching the children." He picked up the hinge again, turned it in his hand. He used the word improper. "What did you say?" Elias was quiet for a moment. "I told him my children were learning and my accounts were in order and what happened in my house was my business." He glanced at her. He didn't like that. "I imagine not." Clara leaned against the wall. "He's going to make it formal. Whatever objection he has, it's going to go to the board." "Probably." "That's going to cause you problems. With customers. With—" "I know what it'll cause," Elias said. Not sharply, just with the finality of someone who has already made the calculation and accepted the result. Clara looked at him. "You don't have to do this," she said. "I can find another situation." He looked up from the hinge. "Can you?" She didn't answer because the honest answer was probably not. Not in this town, not now, and they both knew it. Then stop suggesting things that aren't real options, he said, and went back to the hinge. It was, Clara thought, one of the most practical expressions of support she had ever received. It was also possibly the kindest, in a way that had nothing to do with kindness and everything to do with just seeing the actual situation and responding to it honestly. She went back upstairs and sat with the primer for a while, updating her notes on Sam's progress. He had made it through the first reader in 3 weeks. Not perfectly. He still struggled with anything longer than 3 syllables, and he had a habit of guessing at words from context rather than actually reading them, which she was working to correct. But he was reading. Actually reading, not performing the shape of reading. Last Tuesday, he had picked up a notice that had come in the mail and read it out loud without being asked, and the look on his face when he finished, that involuntary, unself-conscious satisfaction, had been one of the better things Clara had witnessed in recent memory. She thought about what Nora had said. You fixed the accounts, and Sam is actually reading, and you didn't ask for anything. She hadn't come here to do those things. She'd come here because she had nowhere else to go, and a man had asked her a plain question, and she'd said yes. She'd fixed the accounts because they needed fixing, and she could fix them. She'd pushed Sam past his resistance because it was her job, and his resistance was the specific kind that she knew how to work around. None of it had been a strategy. She didn't have strategies. She was a woman who had lost her father and her position and her housing all within 6 weeks of each other, and she was trying to find a handhold on something solid enough to hold her weight, and the forge had been what was there. But there was something else now, something she hadn't expected and wasn't quite ready to name. When Sam sat beside her at the kitchen table and sounded out a word he'd never managed before, the satisfaction she felt wasn't professional. When Nora's voice had shaken through the wall that night after Elias talked to her about the accounts, Clara had found herself sitting very still in her room with something behind her sternum that was warm and slightly frightening in the way that things are frightening when you realize you've started to care about their outcome. She was careful with it. She was very, very careful. The next morning, Sam came downstairs with the primer under his arm and set it on the table before breakfast and said, without preamble, "I want to do the hard chapter today." Clara looked at him. His hair was messy and he had a small cut on his chin from something she didn't know about yet, and he was 7 years old and he had decided overnight that he wanted the hard chapter. "All right," she said, "after biscuits." "Your biscuits are still kind of heavy," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm working on it." He sat down and picked one up and ate it anyway, and across the table Nora was trying not to smile and failing, and from the forge came the sound of Elias beginning his morning work, metal and heat and the steady patience of a man who makes things that last, and Clara Whitlock, who had arrived in Red Hollow with nothing but a trunk and a worthless letter and a brass bell that had been her mother's, sat in the kitchen of a blacksmith's house and felt, for the first time in a year, that had tried very hard to destroy her, something she was almost afraid to call by its right name. Not happiness exactly. Something quieter than happiness, and maybe more durable. Something that felt like belonging to a place just slightly before that place had agreed to belong to you back. She reached for a biscuit. "They're getting better," she said. "A little," Sam agreed seriously, and the morning kept going. The letter arrived on a Thursday. Clara knew it was official before she opened it, because it had the school board stamp on the outside, and it had been hand-delivered by a boy she didn't recognize who knocked on the forge door and left without waiting for a response. She turned it over in her hands twice before she broke the seal. She had learned, in the last month, to prepare herself before opening things. Her father's doctor's letters had taught her that. Some communications exist purely to take something away from you, and the only power you have over them is the 2 or 3 seconds between holding them and reading them, when you still don't know what they say. She read it standing just inside the forge door. The school board of Red Hollow, in accordance with its duty to the families of the community, formally requested that Miss Clara Whitlock present herself at a board meeting on the 14th of November to answer questions regarding her suitability for any teaching position within the township. The letter was signed by 3 men, Gerald Fitch's name first. It was not an invitation. The language made that clear enough, requested doing the work that required would have done more honestly. She folded it along its original lines and put it in her coat pocket. Elias was at the anvil with his back to her. She watched him work for a moment, the specific economy of motion that a man develops after years of the same physical task. Nothing wasted, nothing performed, and then she said his name. He looked up. She held out the letter. He read it without changing expression. When he finished, he handed it back. November 14th, he said. That's 12 days. I know. He set down his hammer and turned to face her fully, which was something he did when he considered a conversation important enough to stop working for. You gonna go? If I don't go, they'll take it as admission of something, Clara said. And if you do go? Then at least I get to say my piece before they decide. She put the letter back in her pocket. Fitch is behind this. Fitch has been behind most things in this town for about 20 years, Elias said. He put 3 men on that board, and one of the other 2 is afraid of him. What about the third? Elias thought for a moment. Howard Marsh, he said. He's the third. He's got a daughter, 9 years old. Wife died 2 years ago. Different circumstances than... He stopped, redirected. He's been trying to figure out schooling for her. He's not unfair. Clara filed this away. One man on the board who might actually listen. One man who had a daughter who needed what Clara could offer. It wasn't much, but it was something to work with. I'm not going to run, she said. She said it partly to Elias and partly to herself, clarifying it by saying it out loud. I didn't think you were, he said. He picked his hammer back up. Decision made, conversation complete, back to the actual work of the day. Clara went upstairs and sat at her table with a blank piece of paper and began writing down everything she knew about what she was walking into. The next 12 days had a specific quality of pressure to them. Not the sharp, sudden pressure of that first afternoon when Crane had read her name in the street, but something more sustained and exhausting, the pressure of knowing something is coming and having to keep functioning normally while it approaches. She continued lessons every morning. Sam was in the second reader now, and he had developed a habit that both charmed and slightly amused her. When he encountered a word he didn't recognize, he would go completely still for a moment, the way a hunting dog goes still, and then sound it out with intense concentration as if the word was a thing he could catch if he moved carefully enough. He rarely missed twice. Nora had progressed to a point in arithmetic that Clara hadn't entirely anticipated. The girl had a mind that didn't just understand numbers but saw their relationships, how quantities connected, how patterns in one column predicted patterns in another. Clara had started bringing her actual problems to work through rather than textbook exercises, and Nora worked them with a focus that was almost uncomfortable to watch, because it was the focus of someone who has finally been given something commensurate with what they're capable of, and the relief of it is visible from the outside. On the evening of the 5th day before the meeting, Clara was in the kitchen after supper when Sam came and sat beside her without a book. This was unusual enough that she looked at him. He was quiet for a moment, arranging something in his mind. "Miss Clara," he said, "are they going to make you leave?" She looked at him. His face was doing that thing it did when he was working out something he'd already decided he wanted to understand clearly, the same expression he wore over difficult words. "I don't know," she said. She didn't say no, of course not, because she didn't know if that was true, and he would know she was lying. He nodded slowly. "Nora's worried," he said. "I know." "I am too," he said. Then quickly, as if admitting it was slightly embarrassing, "A little." "That's fair," Clara said. He picked at a rough spot on the table edge. "I finished the chapter about the farmer," he said. "The hard one. With the flood." She hadn't assigned that chapter. She hadn't assigned anything for today. "You read it on your own?" "It took a long time," he said, defensive. "I'm sure it did," she said. "That chapter has some long words." He nodded, kept picking at the table. "My ma's name was Mary," he said it so quietly and with so little transition that it took Clara a half-second to follow him. "Mary. I know how to spell it now. He stopped. "I've been practicing writing it, in case I forget what it looks like." Clara set down what she was holding. "I think," Sam said, still not looking at her, "that she would have liked you to teach me." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a wind had picked up, and she could hear it finding the gap under the forge door the way wind does in autumn when the season is making its seriousness known. "Thank you, Sam," she said. She kept her voice even. She was not going to cry in front of a 7-year-old boy who had just said something that cost him something to say. She was not. He looked up at her then. "You're not going to run," he said. He said it as a statement, checking it. "No," she said. "I'm not going to run." He nodded once, Elias's nod, the same short, decisive movement, and got up and went to bed. Clara sat at the table for a long time after that. She was still sitting there when she heard the forge door, and then Elias's footsteps in the passage, and then he appeared in the kitchen and stopped when he saw her. "Late," he said. "I know." He poured himself a cup of water, stood at the counter. He didn't ask what she was thinking about. He didn't try to fill the silence with something reassuring. He just stood there in the way he had of being present without demanding anything of the presence. And Clara had the sudden acute awareness that she had not been around many people who could do that. Most people couldn't. Most people filled silence because silence made them nervous, and their filling of it was always in some small way about themselves. "Sam talked to me tonight," she said. Elias was quiet for a moment. "What did he say?" "He told me about your wife." She paused. "He said her name. He said he's been practicing spelling it so he doesn't forget what it looks like." Something moved across Elias's face. It moved fast, the way things move when a person doesn't intend to let them show, but they surface anyway before control arrives. He set his cup down. He looked at the window. "He stopped saying her name," Elias said, "after she died. Just stopped. I didn't push it. I didn't know what the right thing to do was." "There's often no right thing," Clara said. "There's just what's available." He looked at her then. "You've done more in 6 weeks than—" He stopped himself. "You don't have to say that." "I know I don't have to." The edge in his voice wasn't directed at her. "I don't do things I don't have to do. You ought to know that by now." Clara looked down at the table. Something about this conversation was moving in a direction she wasn't ready to examine closely. She picked up the paper she'd been writing on earlier. "I've been thinking about the meeting," she said, redirecting, "about what I'm going to say." He let her redirect without comment. That was another thing about him. "And?" "I need to tell the truth," she said. "All of it. Why I left Grayford. What happened with my father. I've been avoiding telling the full story because—" She paused. "Because telling it feels like asking for sympathy. And I don't want sympathy. I want them to see that what I did was right, even if it was inconvenient for other people." "Those aren't the same thing," Elias said. "No, they're not." "Tell the truth," he said. "People here mostly know when someone's performing and when someone's just talking." He picked his cup back up. "Fitch will push no matter what you say. Marsh might actually listen." "That's what I thought too," Clara said. "Then go in and say what's true and let the chips fall where they fall." It was not elegant advice. After the forge went quiet, and the wind kept finding that gap under the door, and she thought it was probably the most useful thing anyone had said to her in months. She went to the meeting on November 14th with her father's letters in her coat pocket. The doctor's letters. The ones documenting his illness. The ones she had carried since Grayford and never shown anyone because she hadn't wanted to need them. The meeting was held in the same town hall building she'd seen on her first day, the one with the faded sign. Inside, it was less grand than it sounded. A wooden room with a long table at one end and a dozen chairs set out facing it, about half of them already occupied when Clara arrived. People she recognized by sight and didn't know by name. The Crane family in the second row, Martha Crane in particular, sitting with her back very straight and the expression of someone who has arrived early specifically to demonstrate that they belong there. Gerald Fitch was already at the board table. I was a compact man in his mid-50s with excellent posture and the particular kind of confidence that comes not from certainty but from long practice at pretending to certainty. He looked at Clara when she entered, assessed her, and looked away. And the dismissal in it was so clean and total that it almost functioned as a kind of respect. At least he considered her worth dismissing. She found a chair near the end of the row. She took off her coat, folded it across her lap, and waited. Elias came in 4 minutes after she did. She had not asked him to come. He hadn't told her he was coming. He sat down 2 chairs away from her, nodded once when she looked at him, and then looked at the board table with the expression of a man who has come to pay close attention. The third board member, Howard Marsh, arrived last. He was younger than Fitch, somewhere around 40, with the look of a man who has been through something difficult recently and is only partially on the other side of it. He sat down at the table without looking at the room. Sheriff Crane, who was apparently attending in some official or semi-official capacity, sat against the wall to the left. Fitch called the meeting to order. He was, Clara had to admit, effective. He laid out the case against her with the smooth competence of someone who had done this kind of thing before. Not just this specific meeting, but the general work of making someone look bad through careful selection of true things. He cited Grayford. He cited the letters from the angry families. He cited, with a delicacy that was worse than bluntness would have been, the question of what it said about a woman's character that she lived in a working man's home without formal arrangement. He didn't raise his voice once. He didn't need to. The second board member, a thin man named Pell, who kept looking at Fitch to gauge how he was supposed to react, nodded at regular intervals. Marsh took notes. He didn't nod. When Fitch finished, he turned to Clara with the courtesy of someone who has already decided the outcome and is extending process as a formality. "Miss Whitlock, you may speak." Clara stood up. She had rehearsed this. She had written it out and then thrown the writing away and then mentally rehearsed it again. She had decided on plain language and true things, following Elias's advice not because it was elegant, but because it was correct. "I left Grayford," she said, "because my father was dying." The room was quiet. "I received a telegram on a Tuesday morning telling me his lungs had filled with fluid and the doctor believed he had 3 weeks at the outside. I was his only family. I wrote 5 letters to the school board, to the county administrator, to the parents of my students, to a qualified woman who I believed could substitute, and to the superintendent of the district. I did not vanish. I did not abandon those children. I arranged what could be arranged, and I went to my father because he was dying and he was alone." She reached into her coat pocket and took out the letters. She had them organized by date. "These are the doctor's letters," she said. "This one documents the diagnosis. This one documents the progression. This one is dated the day my father died, written to me by the doctor because my father could no longer write himself." She set them on the table in front of Fitch. "The letters from the angry families that Mr. Fitch received, I don't doubt they're real. Some of those families were angry before I left. I didn't leave because things were easy. I left because my father was dying. Those are different things." Fitch picked up the letters. His expression didn't change. "I can't teach in Grayford anymore," Clara continued. "I don't have the illusion that this has worked out without consequences for anyone. What I'm asking you to consider is whether what I did, given the actual circumstances, represents the character of someone unfit to teach." She paused. "Or whether it represents the decision of a woman who understands that there are things that matter more than being convenient." The room was still for a moment. Then a voice from the chairs behind her said, "How long had you been at Grayford before your father got sick?" She turned. It was a woman she didn't know, middle-aged, with work-roughened hands and an expression of genuine question rather than challenge. 3 years, Clara said. The woman nodded and was quiet. Fitch set the letters down. "The question before this board is not primarily about Grayford," he said, smooth as a reset. "The question is the current arrangement, which several members of this community have found irregular." "Irregular," Claire repeated. "A single woman, living in a household with a widowed man and his children, without formal employment, without—" "She's employed," Elias said. The room shifted. Clara turned. Elias was standing. He hadn't been standing a moment ago. He'd moved so quietly that the room hadn't noticed until he was already up. "She teaches my children," he said. "Every morning, 6 days a week. My son is reading. My daughter's arithmetic is better than mine." He paused. "Her arrangement in my household is formal enough that I put food on the table and she teaches my children and the accounts are in order for the first time in 8 months. If that's irregular to you, Mr. Fitch, I'd be curious what you'd call it." Fitch's eyes moved to Elias with the specific look of a man recalculating. "Mr. Boone, this meeting is for the board to—" "I know what the meeting's for," Elias said. He wasn't loud. That was the remarkable thing. He wasn't performing anger or performing courage. He was just speaking, steadily, the way he did everything. "My children need teaching. This woman taught them. I'd like someone in this room to explain to me what the actual objection is, and I'd like it said plain, without the words irregular or propriety." Silence. Fitch opened his mouth. "My boy," Elias said, cutting across him, "hasn't said his mother's name since she died. Not once. Last week he spelled it out for Miss Whitlock. Letter by letter." He stopped. His jaw was tight. This was costing him something. Not the speaking of it, but the allowing of it to be public. The making of his son's private grief into evidence in a room full of people who were mostly using this meeting as an opportunity to feel righteous. She did that. She didn't do it by being irregular. She did it by showing up every morning and doing her job and not running when it got hard. He looked at Fitch directly, which is more than some people in this room have credit for. The silence that followed had a different quality than the silences before it. This one had weight. This one had the particular quality of a room in which something has been said that can't be unsaid, and everyone is in the process of adjusting to that. Martha Crane, Clara noticed, had stopped sitting with her back perfectly straight. Howard Marsh was not looking at his notes anymore. He was looking at Elias. Fitch recovered first, because men like Fitch always recover first. It's the primary skill their kind of confidence actually provides. Mr. Boone's personal feelings are understandable, he said, but they don't constitute— What would constitute? Marsh asked. Fitch turned to look at him. The question had been quiet, but it had been precise, and the precision of it was interesting, Clara thought. It wasn't hostile, it was just asking the actual question. I beg your pardon, Fitch said. What would constitute sufficient evidence of character, Marsh said, for a woman who left a job to attend a dying parent, documented with medical letters, with 3 years of prior service, to be considered fit to teach? He looked at the letters on the table. I have a daughter, he said. She's 9. She's been without proper instruction for 8 months. He looked at Clara. My daughter's name is June, he said. Can she come to lessons? The room went very still. Clara looked at him. Yes, she said. Of course. Fitch said something. Clara barely heard it. She was watching Marsh, and Marsh was writing something in his notes. And Pell was looking at Fitch, waiting for a signal that wasn't coming with the same urgency and certainty it had been coming with before. And in the chair against the wall, Sheriff Crane was studying the floor with the specific attention of a man who is deciding whether the ground is still solid. The meeting concluded without a formal resolution. That was Fitch's work. He was too experienced to allow a vote he might lose to go on record, so instead the meeting was adjourned for further consideration, which everyone in the room understood meant that the decision had not gone the way he had engineered it to go, and he needed time to recalibrate. Clara understood this. She was not under the illusion that Fitch was finished. Men like Fitch were never finished after one loss. They reconstituted. They found new angles. They waited. But something had happened in that room. She felt it as she put her coat back on. She felt it in the way people moved around her on the way out. Not the pointed avoidance of her first weeks, but something more undecided, more open. The woman who had asked her how long she'd been in Grayford touched her arm briefly as she passed and didn't say anything, but the touch was not nothing. Outside, the November air was cold and direct, and Clara stood in it for a moment and breathed. Elias came out behind her. He stood beside her on the steps and looked at the street. Marsh is going to let June come, Clara said. Yeah, Elias said. That changes the math. If it's Fitch and Pell on one side and Marsh on the other, and there's community sentiment, it changes the math, Elias agreed. She looked at him. He was looking straight ahead, not at her, and his jaw was still set in the particular way it had been set when he'd been speaking, and she thought she understood something about what that had cost him. Not the argument. The argument was just logic and facts, and Elias was good at both. What it had cost him was the use of his son's private grief as public evidence, the turning of something that belonged to Sam into something that belonged to a room full of people. You didn't have to say what you said about Sam, she said quietly. He was quiet for a moment. I know, he said. He won't mind, she said. When you tell him, he won't mind. I know that too. He turned up his collar against the cold. He told me what he said to you, about Mary. Clara didn't respond to that. He doesn't talk about her, Elias said. He hasn't in months. I didn't know how to— He stopped. He had the look of someone navigating language that doesn't adequately map to the territory. You made it possible for him to say her name again, he said finally. I don't know exactly how you did that. I just know it didn't happen until you were here. I don't know that I did anything specific, Clara said honestly. Maybe not, Elias said. Maybe it was just time, but it happened on your watch, so you get some of the credit whether you want it or not. She almost laughed. It came out as something smaller, something compressed, but it was close to laughter. That's a very strange form of accounting, she said. I'm a blacksmith, he said. My accounting has always been strange. He started down the steps. Come on, it's cold. Sam's going to want to know what happened, and if we're not back in an hour, he'll have convinced himself of something catastrophic. Clara came down the steps behind him. The street was quiet, the November evening settling over Red Hollow, with the particular gray-blue of a season that has decided to mean business. She walked beside Elias back toward Carver Street and the forge, and the kitchen with its 4 chairs, 3 of them worn, one pushed in tight, and she thought about what Marsh had asked. Can she come to lessons? One child, one father who had a daughter who needed what Clara could give, one vote on a board that was currently 2-1 against her. It wasn't over. She knew it wasn't over. Fitch would reconstitute. He would find another angle because men who had been running a town for 20 years did not lose a single board meeting and consider themselves finished. But something had shifted. She could feel it the way you feel a season changing, not all at once, but in accumulation, in the specific quality of the air and the way sounds carry differently, and the evidence of small things that add up to something undeniable. And Sam, she thought, Sam had written his mother's name until he knew it by heart. Some things, it turned out, you could not take back once they were given. She kept walking. June Marsh arrived on a Monday morning carrying a slate board that was too big for her and a lunch pail that wasn't big enough. And she stood in the forge doorway with the specific expression of a child who has been told to be brave and is doing her level best. She was small for 9, with dark hair cut straight across, and the careful eyes of a child who has spent a significant portion of her life watching adults for information they don't intend to give. Clara recognized the type because she had been the type. Children who lose a parent early develop a particular radar for instability. They learn to read rooms, to sense shifts in adult mood the way animals sense weather. "You must be June," Clara said. "Yes, ma'am." "Very correct. Very prepared." Sam looked up from the table where he'd been working and assessed June with the frank evaluative stare of a 7-year-old. "I'm Sam," he said. "I didn't like reading at first either." June looked at him. "I like reading," she said. "Oh." Sam considered this. "I like it now too," he said, as if this resolved some potential competition. Nora pulled out the chair beside her without being asked. "Sit here," she said, and moved her own papers to make room, and June sat down with the careful posture of someone who isn't yet sure whether she's allowed to relax. And within 20 minutes, the careful posture had softened because Nora had a gift for making people feel enrolled rather than observed. And Clara watched it happen from the other end of the table and thought that Nora's future, whatever it turned out to be, would involve other people's confidence in some fundamental way. Howard Marsh came to collect June that afternoon and stood at the forge door for a moment watching the 3 children bent over the table. Sam working his way through a passage with that hunting dog stillness. Nora checking his work with penciled notations that were more like editorial suggestions than corrections. June doing arithmetic with a focus that suggested she had missed it the way a person misses something they didn't know they needed. "She looks settled," Marsh said quietly. "She's quick," Clara said, and meant it. "Her arithmetic is strong. Her reading comprehension is excellent. She's been without structured instruction for a while, but the foundation is solid." Marsh looked at his daughter for a moment longer. Something in his face had the specific quality of a parent watching a child be okay. The relief of it, and the slight ache underneath the relief. The awareness of how much has been asked of someone small. "Miss Locke," he said, "for what it's worth, the board meeting. I want you to know my position going forward. You don't need to—" "Fitch is going to call another meeting," he said. "He told Pell, and Pell told 2 other people, and one of them told me, which is how this town works. When that meeting happens, I'll be voting differently than he wants." Clara looked at him. "1 vote isn't a majority," she said. "No," Marsh agreed, "but it's a start, and public opinion in this town is shifting, I think. Slowly." He paused. "My daughter has been alone too much. A child that age needs other children, and a person outside the family who thinks her mind is worth developing." He said it simply, without decoration. "You clearly think that. Fitch has never thought that about anyone who couldn't do something for him." He called June, and they left, and Clara stood in the doorway watching them go. June describing something to her father with both hands, whatever restraint she'd maintained all morning apparently now fully released, and thought about what Marsh had said. Shifting. Slowly. She had been in Red Hollow for 2 months. In that time, she had been publicly shamed, unofficially investigated, formally summoned, and indirectly accused of manipulating a widower for personal gain. She had also taught 3 children to various meaningful degrees of improved competence, fixed a business's accounts, and apparently contributed to a 7-year-old's ability to say his dead mother's name. She didn't know what the scales added up to. She wasn't sure the scales were the right way to think about it. Fitch's second meeting arrived in the form of another letter, 3 weeks after the first one, and this time the tone had changed in a specific way that Clara noticed immediately. The first letter had been formal, but had the quality of official process, the sense of something going through proper channels. This letter was also formal, but underneath the formality was something tighter, something with the feel of a person who has had time to get angry about not getting what they wanted the first time. She showed it to Elias at breakfast. He read it, set it down, and ate a biscuit. Clara's biscuits were considerably better now. Sam had been monitoring their improvement with the seriousness of a quality inspector, which had motivated her more than any other form of feedback would have. "He's changed the charge," Elias said. "Yes." The first meeting had been about her fitness to teach. This meeting was about the arrangement in the household specifically, worded in terms of community standards and the moral environment in which children were being educated. Fitch had found his new angle. He was no longer attacking her professional record, which the doctor's letters had made difficult. He was attacking the situation itself, implying that regardless of her teaching ability, the circumstances were inappropriate. "He can't touch the teaching," Clara said, "so he's going after the context." "That's Fitch," Elias said. "When he can't get through the front door, he goes around back." "If the board rules against the arrangement, they're essentially ruling against you directly," Clara said. "They'd be saying your household doesn't meet their standards. That's different from ruling on my fitness. That's my business," Elias said, flat and final. "I know, but it puts you in a position I didn't intend to put you in." He looked at her across the table. His expression had the particular quality it got when he considered something worth saying carefully. "You didn't put me anywhere," he said. "I invited you here. My children's welfare was the consideration. It still is." He paused. "Unless you think I should have let you stand there on the street with your trunk and done nothing." "No," Clara said. "Then stop assigning yourself responsibility for how other people respond to my decisions." This was the quality in him that she had come to, if she was honest with herself, rely on in a way she hadn't anticipated and wasn't entirely comfortable with yet. Not his protectiveness, she didn't need protecting, but his clarity. He saw situations without the additional layer of anxiety that most people applied to situations. The layer of what does this mean about me, and how does this look, and what should I be worried about? He just looked at a thing and said what it was. She had grown up in a house with a father who was kind but anxious, who had worried about everything, and expressed the worry as a kind of ambient tension that she had absorbed so thoroughly. She hadn't known it was there until she was out of it. Elias's particular way of being in a room, present, undemonstrative, uncomplicated in his assessments, was something she was still getting used to. She was getting used to a lot of things. The classroom, such as it was, had grown in ways she hadn't planned for. 3 days after June started, a woman named Frances Whitby came to the forge and asked, with considerable circumlocution and 2 false starts, whether there was any possibility that her grandson might join the lessons. "He was 8, she said. His parents were occupied with a difficult season. She left the nature of the difficulty vague, and he had been without instruction for most of the fall." Clara said yes. 2 days after that, a farmer named Odell came with his daughter, who was 12 and whom he described with the specific embarrassment of a man admitting something he considers a failure, as behind where she ought to be. Clara said yes to her too. By the time Fitch's second meeting arrived, there were 6 children in the forge every morning, seated around the work table, and a second smaller table that Elias had made from scrap wood without being asked, without comment, placing it against the wall one evening while Clara was reviewing lessons, and Sam was supposedly asleep but was actually reading under his blanket with the lamp turned very low. 6 children. 3 families represented beyond Elias's own. Parents who had made the decision to send their children to a woman the school board had not officially sanctioned in a building that was technically a blacksmith's workshop because the results were visible, and results, Clara had found, were harder to argue with than gossip. She understood what Elias had meant about public opinion shifting. She could feel it in the texture of her days. The way the mercantile felt different when she walked in. How the silences that had greeted her in the first weeks had changed from pointed to merely uncertain. Not acceptance exactly, not warmth, but the beginning of a reconsideration. And then the Wednesday before Fitch's second meeting, Nora came home from an errand with color in her cheeks that wasn't cold. Martha Crane came into the dry goods store, Nora said. She put her purchases on the kitchen table with a small controlled deliberateness that meant she was managing something. She was talking to Mrs. Pell about the meeting next week. Clara waited. She said, Nora stopped. Her jaw did the thing it did. She said the arrangement was an embarrassment to the town, and that everyone knew you'd talked Pa into keeping you on because you had nowhere else to go, and that it wasn't the children you were interested in, it was the roof. She paused, and then she said that a decent woman would have left when she had the chance instead of… She stopped again. Instead of what? Clara said. Nora looked at her. Instead of setting her cap at a man who was too lonely and grief-struck to think straight. The kitchen was very quiet. Clara was aware of a specific kind of anger, not the hot, immediate kind, but the cold, deep kind, the kind that sits in your chest and burns slow and clear and is actually more dangerous than the hot kind because it doesn't dissipate quickly. She breathed through it carefully. Did you respond? She asked. No. Nora's voice was tight. I wanted to. I didn't know what to say that wouldn't make it worse. That was the right call, Clara said. Responding to Martha Crane in a dry goods store would give her exactly what she wants. She paused. Nora, what she said, it isn't true. Nora looked at the table. I know that. I need you to actually believe it, not just say it. Nora was quiet for a moment. Then, I believe the part about you caring about the children. She looked up. The other part, about Pa, I don't think it's as simple as Mrs. Crane made it sound. This was sharp enough that Clara felt it land. Nora was 11 years old, and she was watching things that Clara had been trying very hard not to let be visible. And the fact that Nora saw them anyway was either evidence of the girl's exceptional perception or evidence that Clara's self-management was less effective than she'd believed. Possibly both. She did not address the second part. She was not ready to address the second part. Not with Nora, not yet. Not when she hadn't addressed it properly with herself. Whatever anyone in this town thinks about the arrangements here, Clara said carefully, what matters is that you and Sam are learning and the household is running and your father's business is sound. Those things are true regardless of what Martha Crane says in the dry goods store. Nora looked at her for a long moment with those careful, too old eyes. You're going to stay, she said. Not a question. I don't know what the board will decide, Clara said. I didn't ask about the board, Nora said. Clara held her gaze. I'm not planning to leave, she said finally. It was as honest as she could be, which meant it was imprecise in ways she couldn't currently correct. Nora nodded once, picked up her coat to hang it on the peg. Pa's going to the meeting, she said over her shoulder. He didn't say so, but he sharpened his good boots last night. He only does that when something's formal. Clara filed this away with the complicated mix of feelings it produced and said nothing. The night before the second board meeting, she couldn't sleep. She lay on the cot in the small room above the forge and listened to the wind, which had turned genuinely cold now, December making itself known in the specific way that December does when it's decided to mean business. She could hear the forge below her, not active, banked for the night, but present, its heat rising through the floorboards in a way she had come to depend on without quite noticing the dependence forming. She thought about her father's house, the small house in Alderton where she had grown up, where she had come back to at 31 years old to watch her father die over 3 weeks that felt like 3 months and also like 3 minutes. She thought about the day he died. An ordinary afternoon, not dramatic, just a man who had been gradually less and less present, becoming all at once entirely absent, and the particular silence that followed, which was different from every other silence she had ever been in because it had a shape to it. A specific contour that she understood meant she was now completely alone in the world in a way she had not been before. She had left Alderton a week after the burial with nothing arranged, only the letter from Red Hollow's school board that she had applied to before her father got sick. She hadn't known if they would still honor it. She hadn't had another plan. She had packed her trunk, put her mother's bell on top where she could reach it, and got on the stagecoach because forward was the only direction available. She had not expected to find a family. She had not expected to find anything except possibly employment and a room, and she'd managed to lose the employment before she got the room, and yet here she was, 4 months later, lying on a cot above a blacksmith's forge with the smell of coal and iron in her hair and the sound of 3 children breathing somewhere below her. 2 of them hers by arrangement, one of them borrowed from a man who was slowly understanding that his daughter needed more than love to thrive. And something had happened that she hadn't prepared for and wasn't sure she deserved. She had started to belong here. Not to Red Hollow, exactly. Red Hollow was still a mixed proposition, and she held no illusions about that. But to this specific building, this specific household, these specific people, Nora with her fierce, careful mind, Sam with his determined jaw, and his secret late-night reading, Elias who sharpened his good boots before something formal, and never said anything that wasn't true, and picked up her trunk on a street where everyone else was walking away. She was lying on a cot in the dark, thinking about a man who had sharpened his boots, which was either a completely reasonable thing to be thinking about, or a sign that she had become less cautious than she should be, and she wasn't entirely sure which. She got up before dawn, made biscuits. They were better now. The second board meeting had twice the attendance of the first one. Clara noticed this immediately. The room was nearly full, with people standing along the back wall, and the composition was different from the previous meeting. More working people, less of the property-owning merchant class that had dominated the first time. She saw Francis Whitby near the middle, and the farmer Odell 2 rows back, and Howard Marsh at the board table looking like a man who has slept well and made his decisions. She saw Elias's sharpened boots in the second row before she saw his face. She sat down. Her coat was in her lap. Her hands were steady. Fitch opened the meeting. He had refined his argument. She could tell from the first 2 minutes that he'd worked on it, made it more polished, anticipated the counter moves from the previous meeting. He acknowledged the doctor's letters. He did not dispute her teaching ability. He concentrated his fire entirely on the question of the household arrangement, using language that was careful enough to avoid specific accusation while making specific implication very clear. He talked about standards and community values and the environment in which children learn, and every time he said environment, he meant something else, and everyone in the room knew it. Pell nodded. It was, Clara thought, the man's primary contribution to any meeting. When Fitch finished, he turned to Clara. She stood. She had decided something the night before while lying awake. She had decided not to defend the arrangement in the terms Fitch had framed it, because defending it in those terms meant accepting that his framing was the correct one. She was not going to do that. Mr. Fitch has spent considerable effort suggesting that my presence in the Boone household constitutes something that needs explaining, she said. I'd like to address that directly, and then I'd like to address something else. Fitch's expression remained smooth. The floor is yours, Miss Whitlock. I live above a blacksmith's forge. I teach 2 children in exchange for a room and meals. I have done this for 4 months. In that time, Mr. Boone's son has gone from being unable to read simple 3-letter words to completing the second reader. She paused to let this be accurate, not rhetorical. Independently, without prompting, including chapters I had not assigned him. His daughter's arithmetic has reached a level where she is now capable of managing a small business's accounts, which she in fact did, saving her father from losses that would have significantly damaged his livelihood. She kept her voice level. June Marsh is learning at a rate that suggests she was simply waiting for the opportunity. 2 additional children have joined our lessons in the past 3 weeks because their parents decided to send them. Those parents are in this room. She looked at Fitch directly. Now, Mr. Fitch would like this board to decide that those outcomes are tainted by the environment in which they occurred. I would like this board to consider something else. She paused. I would like you to consider what it means for a town when the people who hold power over its children's education use that power to make a woman stand in the street and hear her name read like a verdict before she's had the chance to do a single thing wrong in your presence. The room was very still. I left a job to sit beside my father while he died. I came to your town with a letter that said I was hired. I was publicly accused and dismissed before I taught a single hour. And in the 4 months since, I have taught 6 children, kept a household, and given no one a single legitimate reason to question my character. She set her hands flat on the back of the chair in front of her. I am not asking for sympathy. I am asking this board to do what it said it was doing the first time. Make a decision based on evidence, not on what Mr. Fitch finds convenient. She sat down. The room stayed quiet for a moment that stretched. And then Francis Whitby said loudly, and without particular concern for decorum, "My grandson reads better than his father did at twice his age." Someone in the back coughed, or laughed. It was ambiguous. Clara kept her face still. Odell said without standing up, "My daughter came home last Tuesday and did the winter tallies herself. First time I didn't have to help her with figures." Fitch said very smoothly, "The board appreciates the community's input." "I'd like to call a vote," Marsh said. Fitch looked at him. "The matter isn't ready for—" "I think it is," Marsh said. He looked at Pell. Pell was looking at his hands. "We have 3 board members. We have evidence. We have community testimony." He looked at Fitch. "Unless there is a specific additional question that needs addressing, I believe we have everything we need." Fitch said nothing for a moment. His particular kind of confidence, Clara had noticed, worked best in rooms where everyone assumed he would prevail. When that assumption became uncertain, the confidence became visibly a performance rather than a natural state. She could see it happening now, the slight recalibration, the assessment of the room. The room was not with him. "Very well," he said. The vote was 2-1. Marsh voted to formally recognize Clara's teaching arrangement as legitimate and to recommend her for the official township teaching position when it came up for appointment in the spring. Pell, to Clara's genuine surprise, voted with him. Fitch voted against, and his single dissenting vote had the quality of something that has been trying to hold a tide back and has simply run out of time. Clara sat very still while the result was read. She was aware of the sound of the room changing, the particular sound of people beginning to talk to each other, the sound of attention releasing into ordinary conversation, which is not a dramatic sound but is one of the most distinct sounds she knew. She was aware of Elias, 2 rows ahead, who had not turned around. Francis Whitby was suddenly beside her and was saying something warm and slightly too loud, and she responded. She said the right things. She was present enough. But part of her was somewhere else, working through what had just happened with the careful attention she gave to things that mattered too much to rush. 2-1. She had not expected Pell. She found out why Pell had changed his vote approximately 40 minutes later, in the cold outside the town hall, when the man himself came and stood beside her with the look of someone who has done something that required more courage than he's usually called upon to provide. "My son is 8, he said. "He's been struggling." He didn't look at her. "I heard what Boone's boy did. The reading. The name." He stopped. "My wife told me I was a fool for following Fitch. She's usually right about that kind of thing." Clara looked at him. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, still not looking at her, and walked away quickly, as if he'd spent his entire allotment of directness on those 3 sentences. On the steps, Elias was standing with his hands in his coat pockets. He looked at her when she came out, and she looked at him, and for a moment they just stood there in the cold with the noise of people leaving the meeting around them. 2-1, she said. "I heard," he said. "I didn't expect Pell." "I did," Elias said. "His wife's been talking about sending their boy to you for 2 weeks. I heard it at the feed store." Clara stared at him. "You knew?" "Suspected," he said. Not quite a smile. Something adjacent to one. "You could have told me," she said. "You were doing fine on your own," he said. "You didn't need encouragement. You needed the truth, which was that the room was different from what Fitch thought it was." She looked at him. The cold was sharp and clear, and the sky had the particular pale quality of a December afternoon that was already making its way toward dark. And Elias Boone was standing on the steps of a town hall with his good boots sharpened and his hands in his pockets, and the look of a man who had done what he came to do and was ready to go home. "Why did you come?" she asked. Not accusatory, just asking the actual question. He was quiet for a moment. "Because you came to Red Hollow to work," he said. "And someone needs to make sure the work gets a fair hearing." He paused. "And because my children need you." Another pause. Shorter. "And because—" He stopped. The "and because" hung there in the cold air between them, incomplete, and Elias Boone, who never started sentences he didn't finish, looked at her for a moment with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not uncertain exactly, but careful in a new way, careful the way a man is careful with something he's not sure yet whether he's allowed to want. He didn't finish the sentence. "We should get back," he said instead. "Sam will be awake." He'll be reading under his blanket with the lamp too low, Clara said. Probably. The almost smile again. Come on. They walked back through the December streets of Red Hollow, not quite side by side, but close enough. And Clara carried the outcome of the vote and the unfinished sentence and the particular warmth of knowing that 6 children were getting better at things that mattered, and that tomorrow morning they would all be back at the work table and the new smaller table that Elias had made without being asked. And the lessons would continue, and the forge would be warm, and none of it was resolved yet, but all of it was real. She thought about what Nora had said. I didn't ask about the board. She thought about the incomplete sentence on the town hall steps. She walked and said nothing, and let the cold be cold and the dark be dark and the unresolved be unresolved, because some things needed their own time. And she had learned, the hard way, and more than once, that rushing toward clarity before it was ready served no one. But she was warm enough, walking. That was something. The unfinished sentence stayed with Clara for 3 days. She didn't mention it. Elias didn't finish it. They went back to the forge and the kitchen and the morning lessons and the particular rhythm of a household that had quietly become functional in ways none of them had entirely planned. And the unfinished sentence existed in the space between them like a piece of furniture someone had moved slightly out of its usual position. Noticeable, present, not yet addressed. Sam noticed something was different because Sam noticed most things. He had the specific observational gift of a child who had learned early that adults' moods were information he needed to track, and he deployed it constantly and without self-consciousness. He sat at the breakfast table on the Thursday after the board meeting and looked between Clara and his father with the frank assessment of someone reviewing a situation and comparing it to previous data. You're both quiet, he said. We're eating, Elias said. You're usually quiet when you eat, Sam said, with the precision of a child who means this is a different kind of quiet. This is different. Nora, without looking up from her book, said, Sam? What? It is different. Eat your biscuit. Sam ate his biscuit, but he kept looking, and Clara kept her eyes on her coffee, and Elias kept his eyes on the middle distance of a man who has something working in him that he's not yet ready to surface. The official appointment letter came from the township on a Friday morning. It was signed by all 3 board members, including Gerald Fitch, whose signature at the bottom had the quality of something written under duress. The letter slightly more pressured than necessary, the ink slightly heavier. Clara read it twice at the kitchen table before she set it down. The terms were formal and reasonable. A salary, a schoolhouse on the east end of Carver Street that had been sitting empty for 4 months, a housing stipend that would allow her to rent a room at the boarding house 2 streets over. The appointment was for the spring term beginning in March, with an optional extension through the following year pending review. It was everything she had come to Red Hollow for. She sat with it for a long time. She was sitting with it when Elias came in from the forge at mid-morning, which he rarely did. He generally worked through until noon without interruption, and the fact of him appearing in the kitchen doorway at 10 o'clock meant something had shifted in the way he was managing whatever was working in him. He saw the letter on the table. He looked at her. It came, she said. He came and read it over her shoulder, not touching it, just reading. She was acutely aware of his proximity, which was new, or rather, the awareness of it was new. The awareness that she had stopped not noticing him at some point in the past weeks and had started noticing in the specific way that was harder to manage. Congratulations, he said. He said it simply, and she believed he meant it. Thank you. She looked at the letter. The housing stipend covers the boarding house on Miller Street. A pause. I know the place, he said. It's decent. So I should probably, she started. You should probably do whatever you decide to do, he said. His voice was careful. Not cold. Elias was never cold, but careful in the new way she'd noticed on the town hall steps, the way of a man handling something he doesn't want to damage by moving too fast. She looked up at him. Elias. He waited. You didn't finish what you were saying, she said. The other night, on the steps. He held her gaze. He was not a man who looked away from things. I know, he said. Are you going to? He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He put his hands flat on the table, working man's hands, scarred along the knuckles, permanently marked by the work, and looked at them for a moment. I've been thinking about how to say it right, he said. I don't want to say it wrong. You don't generally say things wrong, Clara said. This is different. He looked up. Clara, when Mary died, I told myself the important thing was the children, getting them through it, keeping the forge running, making sure the practical things kept happening so that everything else didn't fall apart. He paused. That's not wrong. Those things needed doing. But after a while it became the practical things were all there were. Not because I was sad exactly, more because I'd stopped remembering that anything else was possible. Clara was very still. Then you showed up, he said, in the worst possible way, carrying a trunk nobody would help you with, on a street where everyone was walking away from you. And I thought, he stopped. I didn't think anything sentimental. I thought, she can teach. My children need teaching. That's a practical arrangement. It was practical, Clara said, for about 3 weeks, he said. After that, I don't know what it was, but it wasn't only practical. He looked at her directly. You fixed the accounts because Nora was worried about me, not because I asked. You sat with Sam at that table night after night until he stopped being afraid of what he couldn't do. You stood in that board meeting and said true things clearly, and you didn't apologize for any of it. He paused. And I found that I was looking forward to mornings, specifically to the point in the morning when you came downstairs, which is not something I can explain as practical arrangement. Clara's hands were in her lap. She was holding them still with some effort. I'm not asking you to stay because of the children, he said. The children would be fine, eventually. I'm not asking because of the accounts, or the forge, or any practical thing. He looked at the letter on the table. You should take the position. You earned it. You should take the housing stipend and the schoolhouse and everything you came here for. He looked at her. And I'm asking you, separately, and in addition to all of that, whether there's any possibility that you'd be willing to stay. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, she could hear the wind working at the eaves, the particular December sound of a season that had fully committed to itself. You're asking me something specific, she said carefully. I'm asking if you'd marry me, he said. That's what I'm asking. I know it's fast and the circumstances are unusual, and you have every reason to take what the board offered and put distance between yourself and everything that happened in this town, including me. He paused. I also know I mean it, which is the only thing I'm certain of. Clara looked at him for a long moment. The thing was, she had been here before. Not this exactly, not this kitchen, and this man, and this particular question, but the position of being offered something significant when she was still raw from loss, still uncertain of her footing, still in the process of becoming stable enough to be trusted with her own decisions. She had watched her mother make choices from a place of need rather than genuine wanting, and she had watched what that cost over years. She had promised herself, at some point between her mother's death and her father's, that she would not do the same. She looked at Elias Boone, at his hands flat on the table, at the way he held her gaze without pressure, at the fact that he had framed the question in a way that explicitly gave her the exit first, the position, the stipend, the schoolhouse, before the ask, as if he understood that the offer needed to be fully real before the question could be fairly posed. He had, she thought, said it exactly right. I need to tell you something first, she said. He waited. That was another thing. He was very good at waiting. I'm not easy, she said. I think most people who've known me would say I have strong opinions, and I express them, and I don't back down from things I believe are right. My father said I argued like a lawyer and meant it as a criticism. I took it as a compliment. She paused. I will always have opinions about your accounts, and how Sam is progressing, and whether Nora is being given enough room for what she's actually capable of. I won't be able to turn that off. I've tried, and it doesn't work. I know, Elias said, the almost smile. I've been living with it for 4 months. I'm serious. So am I. He looked at her steadily. Clara, I spent 8 years married to a woman who made me a better man by telling me what she actually thought instead of what she thought I wanted to hear. I'm not looking for something easier. I'm looking for something real. The thing that moved through her then was not romantic in the way stories make romance. It was not a swelling or a rushing or a clarity like light. It was more like a door that has been stuck for a long time finally opening, not dramatically, just opening. The simple specific relief of a thing that was closed becoming no longer closed. Yes, she said. Elias's face did something she had never quite seen it do. Not the almost smile, Something more than that, something that his particular reserve didn't usually allow to reach the surface. It lasted only a moment. Then he became himself again, which is to say present and steady and not given to excess. "All right," he said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, briefly, the way he did everything. Without fanfare, with complete intention. "Good. Good," she said. They sat there for a moment in the kitchen with the December wind working at the eaves and the forge warming the floor beneath them. And neither of them said anything else because nothing else needed saying. And then Elias got up and went back to work because there were orders to fill. And Clara picked up the appointment letter and thought about the schoolhouse on the east end of Carver Street. She was going to need considerably more chalk. Telling the children was Elias's idea, and he suggested doing it at supper, which Clara initially thought was practical, and then realized was strategic. The supper table was a contained space where reactions could be managed, and nobody could run very far in any direction. Sam went first, as he usually did, because Sam had no mechanism for waiting on things. "Are you going to be our mother?" he asked, looking at Clara directly. "Sam," Nora said. "No, let him ask," Clara said. She looked at Sam. "I'm going to be your stepmother. That's different from your mother. Your mother was Mary, and she'll always be your mother, and nothing about this changes that." Sam thought about this with the seriousness he brought to difficult words. "But you'll be here," he said, "like a mother is here." "Yes?" Clara said. "I'll be here." He nodded, processing. "Okay," he said. Then, practically, "Can I still call you Miss Clara?" Elias made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "If you want to," Clara said. "I think I'll see," Sam said, with the gravity of someone who takes naming seriously, which he did, because he knew what it cost to lose a name you needed. Nora was quiet through this. She had been quiet since Elias said what he had to say, which was unlike her, and Clara watched her carefully. Not with alarm exactly, but with the attention of someone who understood that Nora's silences were rarely empty. After supper, Nora found Clara washing dishes and stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment before coming in. "Are you happy?" Nora asked. Simple and direct, the way she did things when she'd worked out what she actually wanted to know. Clara thought about the honest answer. "Yes," she said. "I think I am." She paused. "Are you?" Nora was quiet for a moment. "I was afraid," she said. "After the board meeting, when the letter came, I thought, if she has the position and the housing, there's no reason she has to stay." She looked at the floor. "I didn't say anything because it felt selfish. You're not mine. You don't owe us anything." "Nora," Clara said, "I know it sounds honest," Clara said. "Don't apologize for it." She dried her hands and turned to face the girl fully. "I want you to understand something. I'm not staying because I owe you or because I don't have options. I'm staying because this is where I want to be. That's different, and the difference matters." Nora looked at her, the careful eyes, the ones that saw too much. "Okay," she said, and then quietly, in a voice that was younger than she usually allowed herself to sound, "I'm glad you're staying." Clara put her hand briefly on the girl's shoulder. "So am I," she said. The schoolhouse on the east end of Carver Street turned out to be structurally sound and aesthetically dismal, which Clara considered an acceptable starting point. She spent the 3 weeks before the spring term cleaning it, repairing what was repairable, and making a detailed list of what needed to be ordered. Elias fixed the windows that had warped in their frames without being asked. Sam and Nora helped clean and regarded this as an adventure and bickered productively about where the desks should go. June Marsh came one Saturday with her father, who spent 2 hours replacing the floorboards near the door that had begun to rot, and Clara understood this as Howard Marsh's particular form of expressing a position. Fitch was quiet. This was notable because Fitch had not been quiet at any point since Clara's arrival, and the quiet had a quality she found herself watching with the wariness of someone who knows that silence from a particular direction doesn't necessarily mean absence. She found out what the silence contained on a Tuesday afternoon in late February when Gerald Fitch walked into the schoolhouse while she was organizing the reading materials for the first week's lessons. She looked up. He looked at her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Fitch was, in person, without a meeting table between them, a smaller figure than he seemed when he was performing authority. He was also, she realized, not as certain as he usually appeared. Something in the way he stood had the quality of a man who has rehearsed an approach and is now, in the actual presence of the situation, less confident in the rehearsal than he was this morning. "Miss Whitlock," he said. "Mr. Fitch." He looked around the schoolhouse, at the cleaned floors, the repaired windows, the organized shelves. His expression did something complicated that she couldn't entirely read. "You've done considerable work," he said. "The children start Monday," she said. She did not offer him warmth, but she did not offer him hostility either. She had decided, at some point she couldn't precisely locate, that hostility toward Fitch cost more than it was worth, not because he deserved her forbearance, but because maintaining it required more of her energy than she wanted to spend on him. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I owe you something," he said. He said it like it was being pulled out of him rather than offered. She waited. "My opposition to your appointment was—" He stopped, started again. "I received the letters from Grayford before I received anything else, and I made a determination before. I should have looked at all the information before I acted publicly." Clara looked at him. "You humiliated me in front of the entire town before I had been here for an hour," she said. Not heated, factual. "Yes," he said. The word cost him something. "And you spent the following months attempting to remove me through whatever mechanism was available to you." "Yes." "And the children whose welfare you claim to be protecting," she said, "have spent those same months learning in a blacksmith's forge because your actions made it impossible for them to learn anywhere else." Fitch was looking at the floor. He had the look of a man who has lived inside his own certainty for a very long time and has recently been required to examine its foundations. It was not a comfortable look. Clara did not particularly enjoy his discomfort, but she did not look away from it either. "Yes," he said again. She looked at him for a long moment. "Mr. Fitch," she said, "I'm going to teach school here on Monday. I'm going to teach school here regardless of what happened or what you say now. The children who come through that door are going to receive the best instruction I can give them, including any children whose parents voted against me, and including any children whose parents still have doubts." She paused. "I don't need your apology to do that, but if you're offering it honestly, I'll take it honestly, and we can both move forward." He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression that was not quite respect, but was, she thought, the beginning of a reassessment. "Marsh says you're exceptional," he said, slightly stiffly. "Marsh has a daughter who is learning to think clearly," Clara said. "He's a good judge of results." A pause. "My granddaughter is 6, Fitch said. "She'll be school age in the fall." Clara understood what was not being said in this sentence. She let it sit for a moment. "Every child who walks through that door will be taught the same," she said. "That's the only promise I make, and it's the one that matters." He nodded once. He left without further ceremony, and Clara stood in the empty schoolhouse and breathed and let the February light come through the repaired windows and do what February light does when it falls on clean floors in a room that is waiting to be used. She had not forgiven Fitch exactly. She wasn't sure forgiveness was the right category. It wasn't about him enough for forgiveness. What she had done was more specific and perhaps more useful. She had declined to let his actions define the shape of what came after. He had tried to make her absence his story. She was going to make her presence the one that lasted. She went back to organizing the reading materials. The first day of spring term began with 6 children from the Forge's unofficial classroom and 7 new students whose parents had decided, over the course of the winter, that the woman who had stood in 2 board meetings and said true things clearly was probably worth trusting with their children. 13 children, ranging from 6 to 13 years old, in a repaired schoolhouse on Carver Street with 3 new windows and shelves that Elias had helped build on the Saturday before opening day, while Sam handed him nails with the focused assistance of someone who considers himself essential to any operation. Clara rang her mother's brass bell at 8 o'clock sharp. The sound of it moved through the morning air with a quality that had nothing in common with the first time she had heard it described in this town. Read out alongside her name as a verdict, a symbol of something disqualified. She had put the bell on the corner of her desk the day before, and standing there with it in her hand on the first morning of school, she understood that what she was doing was not consciously symbolic, but was true regardless. The bell had always belonged here. It had traveled through her mother's classroom and her own career and her father's death, and a stagecoach journey, and a public humiliation, and a blacksmith's forge, and 2 board meetings to arrive at this particular morning, in this particular light, calling these particular children through a door that was open. The children came in. Sam came in last, which surprised her, and then she understood. He had waited so that he could hold the door open for June, who had dropped her lunch pail on the step and was retrieving the apple that had rolled out, and he held the door with the elaborate casualness of a 7-year-old boy who doesn't want it to look like he's doing something considerate on purpose. Clara watched this from the front of the room and made no comment on it. Nora, who was 13 now and the oldest in the room, had been given the specific and serious responsibility of helping the youngest students when Clara was working with another group. She wore this responsibility with a dignity that was entirely unperformed. She simply came in and sat beside the 2 6-year-olds and began talking to them quietly, explaining how the morning would go, and the 6-year-olds, who had been looking at the room with the terror of the entirely new, gradually stopped looking terrorized. Clara stood at the front of her schoolhouse, with its repaired windows and its clean floors and its shelves full of books and the small brass bell on the corner of her desk. "Good morning," she said. 13 children said good morning back in the uneven, overlapping way of children who have not yet learned to do things in unison, which Clara had always found more honest than the rehearsed version anyway. She began. The wedding was in April, a Thursday, because Elias said Saturdays were when the week's work caught up with him, and he'd rather be clear-headed, which was the least romantic reason for choosing a wedding day that Clara had ever heard, and which she found entirely characteristic and completely acceptable. There was no ceremony in any building. They stood in the yard beside the forge with Howard Marsh as witness, and Frances Whitby, who had appointed herself to this role without being asked, and who wore her best hat, and cried with the frank unself-consciousness of a woman who has reached the age where she sees no reason to manage what she feels. Nora stood beside Clara. Sam stood beside Elias. Sam was wearing his good shirt, which he had buttoned incorrectly, and then corrected under Nora's intervention, and he stood with his hands at his sides and watched the proceedings with the solemn attention of someone who understands that something important is happening and wants to be worthy of witnessing it. The April wind came through and the forge was behind them, making its particular warmth, and Clara Whitlock became Clara Boone in a yard that smelled like iron and spring mud, and Elias said what he had to say in his steady way without excess, and she said what she had to say in her clear way without apology, and that was that. Frances Whitby wept. Marsh shook Elias's hand, then on apparent impulse hugged him, then stepped back looking slightly surprised at himself. June, who had come with her father, threw a handful of apple blossoms from the tree at the yard's edge that landed mostly in Sam's hair, which he did not appear to mind. Nora hugged Clara. Not performed, not the hug of a child doing what's expected. Just Nora, arms around Clara's waist, face turned against her shoulder for a moment, quick and fierce, and then released. Then Nora straightened and became herself again, composed and careful, and Clara kept her face as steady as she could manage. Sam looked up at Clara after the apple blossoms had been mostly removed from his hair. "Can I call you Ma?" he said. The yard went briefly very quiet. Clara looked at him. He was 7 years old and completely serious and waiting with the patience of someone who has learned that the things worth having sometimes require waiting. "You can call me whatever feels right," she said. "There's no wrong answer." He considered this with appropriate gravity. "I think I'll try it," he said, "and see if it fits." She crouched down to his level. "Your mother's name was Mary," she said quietly. "You told me you practiced spelling it. Don't stop." He nodded. "I know," he said. "You're not the same thing. You're a different thing." "That's exactly right," Clara said. He thought about it one more moment. Then, "Ma," he said, testing it. He looked at her face to see what it did. What it did was something she couldn't have described accurately, so she didn't try. Spring became summer. Summer had its own rhythm. School continued through June, then paused in July when several families needed their older children for fieldwork, then resumed in August when Clara organized what she called informally a summer reading session that was technically optional and attended by 11 of the 13 students, because the children had discovered, as children sometimes do when given the right conditions, that learning was something they actually wanted to do when nobody was making it miserable. The forge prospered. Elias had recovered the $40 in outstanding accounts over the winter, and had taken on an apprentice, a 16-year-old named Cole, who had been without employment since his family's farm failed, and who turned out to have a natural aptitude for metalwork that Elias acknowledged with the specific appreciation of a craftsman recognizing something genuine. Elias was not effusive with praise, but he was precise with it, which Cole seemed to find more useful than effusion would have been. Clara watched her husband with his apprentice and thought about the way he gave instruction. Patient, specific, not wasting words, correcting errors without making the person who made them feel like the error defined them. She thought about how it was exactly the way he'd offered her a room above the forge on the street that first day, and she thought there was probably something in that about who he was at his core, a man who assessed what people needed and provided it without making them feel diminished by the needing. She had strong opinions about this. She told him so one evening. He said she was probably right, in the tone of a man who has accepted that she frequently is and has decided this is more useful than annoying. Their disagreements were real. She wanted to extend the school term. He thought the farming families needed July, and she was wrong to push them. They argued about it at the kitchen table over 2 evenings and concluded in a compromise that pleased neither of them entirely, which Clara privately considered the mark of a functional negotiation. She had opinions about how he was handling a dispute with a supplier. He had opinions about how she was handling a parent who was consistently late, picking up his daughter and leaving the child anxious. Neither of them pretended to have no opinions about the other's domain, and neither of them, mostly, pretended the other's opinions were not worth hearing. Nora turned 14 in October, and Clara began talking to Howard Marsh about the possibility of correspondence courses through a normal school 2 territories east. Marsh, who had by this point become something between a colleague and a friend, a category Clara had not expected to find in Red Hollow, took the inquiry seriously and wrote 3 letters on Nora's behalf without being asked to. "She's going to outgrow what I can teach her," Clara told Elias. She said it directly because that was how she said things. He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "I've been trying not to think about it." "It's not a problem," Clara said. "It's a good thing dressed as a problem. There's a difference." He looked at her. "You sound like yourself," he said. "I should hope so." "I mean," he paused. "Early on, the first weeks, you were careful. Not with me exactly, but with what you let yourself say. You're not careful anymore." Clara thought about this. "No," she said. "I'm not." She looked at him. "Is that a concern?" "It's the opposite," he said. The first snow of this season came in November, and with it came something Clara hadn't expected in a form she hadn't anticipated. Sheriff Aldous Crane came to the schoolhouse on a Wednesday afternoon after the children had gone home. Clara was at her desk reviewing work. She heard the door and looked up and saw him standing in the entrance with his hat in his hands, which was so different from the last several times she had been in his presence that she simply looked at him for a moment, waiting. He was older than he'd seemed on that first afternoon. Or perhaps it was the hat and the hands. People looked different when they removed the instruments of their authority. "Miss Whitlock," he said. Then corrected, "Mrs. Boone." "Sheriff Crane," she said. He didn't come further into the room. He stood at the door with his hat and looked at the desks. 13 desks now, with the work of the day still visible on some of the slates, children's handwriting and arithmetic problems, and the opening lines of a composition assignment she'd set that morning. "My granddaughter starts in January," he said. Clara looked at him. "I know," she said. "Mrs. Crane came to speak with me last week." He nodded. He was looking at the desks. "She's 7, he said. "Her name is Lily." "I know." He turned his hat over in his hands. "I want—" He stopped. He had the specific difficulty of a man who has spent a long time operating from authority and is now required to operate from something more exposed. "I want her to be taught well," he said finally. "Every child in this room is taught well," Clara said. "That's not contingent on anything." He looked at her then. His expression had none of the smoothness of the man who had read her name from a piece of paper and never looked at her. He just looked at her, and what was in his face was something unresolved and effortful, the work of a man who has discovered that a position he took with certainty was not as solid as he believed and is still in the process of adjusting to that knowledge. "I wasn't—" he started. "Sheriff Crane," Clara said. She said it without hardness. "Bring Lily on the first Monday of January. She'll be welcomed and she'll be taught, and what happened before she was born will not follow her through that door. That's my job." She paused. "That's the only thing I need to say." He nodded. He put his hat back on. He left. Clara sat at her desk for a moment after the door closed and thought about the afternoon she had arrived in Red Hollow with a trunk and a worthless letter and 4 days of travel on her and no one willing to look at her except a man who had asked her a plain question. She was not the same woman she had been that afternoon. She was not certain that she was better exactly. More certain, perhaps, more settled in what she was and what she was not, more able to occupy the space she occupied without apology. But she was also, she thought, more complicated than the woman on that street. She had more to lose now. She had more invested in more people and more outcomes. And the vulnerability of that was something she hadn't anticipated when she was traveling light enough to put everything she owned in a single trunk. Sam had a loose tooth that week and was deeply invested in its removal. He had tried twice to pull it himself and had not quite managed it, and the tooth was at the particular stage of barely there that made everything he ate require careful navigation. He came to Clara on Thursday evening with the gravity of someone facing a medical procedure. "Can you pull it?" he said. Clara looked at the tooth. "I can try," she said. "Sit down." He sat at the kitchen table. She found a clean cloth and took the tooth between her fingers, and he made a complicated sound that was part brace and part protest, and she pulled, and it came free, and Sam yelped, and then looked at the tooth in her hand with the satisfaction of something resolved. "Keep it," he said magnanimously. "Thank you," Clara said. "Does it hurt you?" he asked, inspecting his newly gapped grin in the reflection of the window. "When I lose teeth, does it bother you?" She looked at him. "Why would it bother me?" Nora said it might. She said mothers don't like, I don't know. She said they get sad about children getting older. Clara thought about the honest answer. "I think," she said carefully, "that the sadness and the pride get mixed up together and you feel both at the same time. So yes, a little, but mostly the pride part." Sam considered this. "I'm going to lose a lot more teeth," he said, somewhat consolingly. "I know," she said. He went to show his father the gap. That was October. By December, the tooth had been replaced, and Sam had started on the third reader and could do his multiplication tables through 7 and had decided, based on what Clara still couldn't entirely determine, that he wanted to learn everything there was to know about rivers. Not rivers in particular, the science of them, why they bent the way they bent, what made them run fast or slow, where they went. He had asked Clara questions about this for 2 weeks before she got him a book on natural geography from the supply order she put in for the school, and he had read the relevant chapters 4 times with the intensity he brought to things he genuinely wanted. She watched him read and thought about the boy who had sat across from her on the first morning and said he didn't like reading, with the specific resignation of someone who has been told something about himself enough times that he started to believe it. What she had understood then, and understood more completely now, was that the problem had never been reading. The problem had been that no one had yet found the thing Sam would read for. Once you found the thing, the river, the bend, the question that needed answering, the reading was just the tool, and the tool became something you wanted. That was the work. That was always the work. Not the curriculum, not the primers, not the slates and chalk and carefully maintained records. The work was finding what each child was reaching toward and building the bridge from where they were to where that thing was. She wrote this down in her teaching journal one evening, partly because she wanted to remember it, and partly because writing it helped her understand it more completely. She filled several pages, the way she sometimes did when something she'd known instinctively for a long time finally found its proper words. Elias read it the next morning without her knowing, when she'd left the journal on the kitchen table. She came downstairs and found him at his second cup of coffee with the journal open and a look on his face that she had no good category for. "Sorry," he said immediately. "I should have asked." "It's all right," she said. She sat down and looked at him. "What did you think?" He was quiet for a moment. "I think," he said, "that you understand children better than most people understand anything." He paused. "And I think I'm glad you're the one who's teaching them." She looked at her journal. "It's just what I've figured out," she said. "It's not Clara," he said, the way he said her name when he wanted her to stop diminishing something. She had identified this particular inflection approximately 6 weeks into their marriage, and it still worked reliably. She stopped. "It's what you figured out," he said. "That's enough. That's more than enough." She picked up her coffee. The school bell on her desk, her mother's small brass bell, caught the December morning light through the window and held it in that particular way that brass has, not reflecting exactly, more like concentrating. She had placed it there on the first day, and she had not moved it since, and she did not intend to. Some things, she had found, belonged exactly where they were. The year turned. Red Hollow turned with it, in the slow way that small towns turn. Not all at once, not without resistance, not without some people who never quite came around and some things that remained unsettled at the edges. Gerald Fitch never became warm exactly, but his granddaughter Lily turned out to have an aptitude for language that was exceptional, and every time Fitch came to the schoolhouse to collect her, which he did sometimes, in the late afternoons, he saw the results in the child's face, the alive look of someone whose mind is being given what it needs. That look was, Clara suspected, harder to argue with than any board vote. Martha Crane remained, at best, civil. Sheriff Crane brought Lily and himself on the first Monday of January and didn't stay, but he came back at the end of the day and shook Clara's hand briefly and without ceremony, and whatever that was, it was something. Nora began the correspondence course in the spring. The first packet arrived on a Saturday, and she sat at the kitchen table for the entire afternoon working through it, and Clara checked her work in the evening and found it thorough and precise and marked by the specific quality of a mind that had been waiting for material commensurate with what it could do. She wrote back to the normal school with her assessment of Nora's level and her recommendation for the second-year materials, and the responding letter arrived 6 weeks later and said, among other things, that Nora's written work showed unusual clarity and that they hoped to see her apply formally when she reached the appropriate age. Elias read that letter 3 times. He didn't say anything about it for a day. Clara let him not say anything. She understood by now that his silences were working silences, that things processed in him at their own rate and came out when they were ready rather than when requested. The next evening, after supper, he said, "Her mother would have wanted this." "I know," Clara said. "She was smart," he said. "Mary. People didn't always, it wasn't obvious because she was quiet about it, but she was." He paused. "Nora got it from her. Nora got a lot of things from her mother," Clara said, "and she's building on them. That's what children do with what they inherit. They build." He looked at her. "Is that something else you've figured out?" "Working on it," she said. He smiled. Not the almost smile, the actual one, which she had seen perhaps a dozen times in the year and more she had known him, and which remained, she thought, one of the most honest things she had ever seen on another person's face. No performance in it, just a man who was, for a moment, fully at ease. "Good," he said. Outside, the forge was cooling toward evening, and the Carver Street sounds were settling into their nighttime version, and somewhere in the house, Sam was definitely reading past the point he was supposed to be reading, judging by the thin line of lamplight under his door. Nora's correspondence materials were stacked neatly at her end of the table, waiting for morning. Clara Boone, formerly Whitlock, who had arrived in Red Hollow on a Tuesday in 1883 with a trunk. She had to drag herself, and a letter that turned to worthless paper in her pocket, sat at the kitchen table in the house attached to the forge, and thought about the nature of belonging. She had thought, when she was younger, that belonging was something given to you, by a place, by people, by circumstances that lined up correctly. She had thought you either fit or you didn't, and if you didn't, you moved on until you found somewhere that wanted the shape you were. She understood now that it was more like what Elias did with iron. You applied heat and pressure and patience, and the material changed, and you changed with the working of it, and what emerged was something neither you nor the material could have predicted at the start. It was not a smooth process, and it was not a safe process, and the results were never perfectly as planned, but they were real, and they were lasting, and they were yours in a way that things handed to you were never quite yours. She could hear Sam turn a page. She got up and walked down the hall and opened his door without knocking. He knew she did this. It was their established compact. And he looked up from his book with the guilt of someone caught and the satisfaction of someone who knew the guilt was entirely worth it. "River chapter?" she asked. "There's a part about the Mississippi I haven't finished," he said. She looked at the lamp. 5 more minutes, she said. then sleep. 10, he said immediately. 7, she said, and that's final. He looked at her with the calculating expression of a child assessing whether to push further. He decided against it, apparently, because she had learned to hold the line on this specific negotiation, and he had learned that she had learned. Okay, he said. He went back to the book, already re-immersed before she finished pulling the door. She stood in the hallway for a moment. The forge smell was faint from here, almost more a memory than a current scent. The house was warm. The night was doing what December nights do when they've fully committed to being cold and dark. And inside every lamp made a particular quality of gold that she had come to associate with this specific house and no other. She went back to the kitchen. Elias was at the table now, going over an order for a customer in the new town 30 miles east who wanted custom hinge work and had been specific about tolerances in a way that Elias said meant the man had done this before and knew what he was asking for. He looked up when she came in and then went back to the drawings. She sat down across from him with the teaching journal and worked for a while on next week's lesson plans. The lamp between them was steady, the way things are steady when they're in a place where they belong, and the night pressed against the windows the way nights do. And neither of them said anything because nothing needed saying, and the house held them in it, all of them, the living and the remembered, the settled and the still becoming, with the particular solidity of a thing that was built to last. Not perfect, not without its difficult weather, its unresolved edges, its ordinary damage, but lasting. That, Clara had come to understand, was the better thing.